First of all, thank you very much, Orietta, and thank you to all the organizers of this amazing conference. So the title of my paper is A Sentence by Levinas, which I will try to understand. And the sentence is the sense of the death of God, and Levinas add, or of his life. At the end of his preliminary note to Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, Levinas writes, I quote, "To hear God not contaminated by being is a human possibility, no less important and no less precarious than to bring being out of the oblivion in which it is said to have fallen in metaphysics and ontotheology. Otherwise Than Being is indeed meant to criticize deeply the long and mature philosophical and theological tradition that brings God and being together. Levinas does not describe the life of a subject, be it a transcendental one or a psychological one, but the life of the subjectivity. And he describes this subjectivity, I quote, as a sensible point, as a disinterested point, or a subversion of essence, also as a passivity without any assumption. Such is the description of a subjectivity that has to respond to the other. It signifies before being. And as Levinas wants to be more precise, he adds that this signification without being, beyond the perseverance of essence, leads us to think about a new kind of spirituality. In this spirituality, infinity comes to pass, more ancient than the time of remembering, a diachrony without memory, and thus out of season. In this paper, my intention is now to describe this new spirituality. Is indeed this spirituality a spirituality that alludes to another kingship for human lives than that which ties them to being? It is new in the sense that Levinas does not describe this forgetting of being as a decline that would also be the decline of philosophy as Heidegger would have it. According to him, such a forgetting is indeed an aristocratic forgetting, a noble forgetting, a noble ignorance, in the sense that nobility ignores what is not noble, in the sense that certain monotheists do not recognize while knowing what is not the highest. Such ignorance is beyond consciousness. It is an open-eyed ignorance and is an aristocratic ignorance. He also describes it as an exposure without assumption to the emptiness of space, as though this space was full of an invisible air that would penetrate our lungs and obsess us. First point of the paper, emptiness of space. Why does the face of the neighbor obsess me? Levinas answers that it is because nothing is more imperative than this abandon in the emptiness of space. This trace of infinity which passes without being able to enter. In it is hollowed out the face as a trace of an absence. You'll see later it will change. An absence, as a skin with wrinkles. To perceive a face would mean a confrontation with its absolute abandon in the emptiness of space, even if this face has indeed the protection of its social position, of its possible wealth, and of the love of one's family. Yet, such an emptiness does not mean nothing or a void. An incessant buzzing comes from this emptiness. The buzzing of the there is, il y a. A buzzing that is the nonsense in which essence turns. This buzzing, or this incessant murmur of the there is, strikes with absurdity the active transcendental ego beginning and present. Such a buzzing makes uncertain every certainty that the ego may have, beginning with the certainty of the significance it gives to its life. Such was precisely what Pascal experimented in his time. I quote Pascal, "How many realms ignore us? The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightened me." Pascal is frightened since he doesn't perceive any word intended for him coming from these infinite spaces. I quote him again, "I see those frightful spaces of the universe which enclose me, and I find myself attached to a corner of this vast expanse, without knowing why I am placed in this place rather than in another, nor why this little time which is given to me to live is assigned to me at this point rather than to another of all the eternity which has preceded me and of all that follows me. I see only infinities on all sides which enclose me like an atom and like a shadow that lasts only a moment without return." And we have the word point and atom in Levinas also, but we'll see in a very different meaning. Dizziness suddenly tells on the eye of Pascal, that thinks it is present and at the very beginning of its decision, this eye discovers that it is but a mere atom, a mere point among other atoms, a mere shadow among mere shadows, a point among an infinity of points, a point completely abandoned, a point whose life is for nothing. As though the dreadful tohu described in the first verse of Genesis had not surrendered to the voice of God and was going on and on, expanding, while deafening each word that would try to enlighten a little the situation, as though this tohu was submerging every one of us, reducing us to a simple point in the universe that go on expanding without giving us time to begin thinking meaningfully, or giving us very little time indeed. Now, Levinas does not start thinking from such a point of view. He does not rely on an eye that would discover that it is but this point or this atom in the universe. In this emptiness of space, full of noise and agitation, in the cosmic silence, tormented and subject to incessant metamorphosis, he hears the imperative of the face that is abandoned there. and he hears it as if addressed to him and to him only, as if the call of this face held a greater force than the desire of distress of the self that becomes aware of its abandon in the universe. This face would indeed be encountered as though it was standing in the trace of the infinite, a trace that passes without being able to enter the space. Only the face would stand in this trace, meaning that it would not be the self which, by the grace of introspection, for example, or by that of a prolonged meditation on itself and on the world, would finally discover this trace in its own interiority, but thus managing to draw the infinite spaces out of the silence. Only the face could do that. The face would indeed speak to me of the infinity withdrawn from the spaces, but it would do so addressing to me and to me alone, without my being able to dodge the summons to respond to it. Such would be the vivid and invisible air that fills these spaces, despite the invading of the there is, Lilia. Now, how is it that Levinas has such a knowledge? According to what is written in the dedication of Otherwise Than Being, and that Orietta reminded us just now, Levinas' knowledge comes first of all from having noted an empirical and historical fact, the absolute abandonment of the millions and millions of people assassinated because they were victims of the same hatred of the other man, of the same anti-Semitism. In this dedication, anti-Semitism is thought of as the hatred of each person who remains unassimilable to oneself, a person who reminds me of my human vocation as a responsible person. Now, this remains unbearable, intolerable, and unacceptable to all those who refuse such a vocation. Consequently, for all those who were victims of the same anti-Semitism, the breath of infinity never penetrated the spaces, never descended towards them, so as to help them and to save them. During these tragic times, the infinite seemed to be completely withdrawn from the worlds. No voice came down from the other shore. The spaces were saturated with cries and threats. The air became unbreathable because of the bodies that had gone up in smoke, and its emptiness took the form of the insignificance of all the persecuted, and also of the insignificance of all human lives devoted to hatred. The infinite had disappeared, unable to rescue anyone. In the Bible, Job shares very deeply such a feeling of disappearance and loneliness. Eliphaz, one of his so-called friends, blames him for thinking that thick clouds are a covering to God, preventing him, God, from seeing what happens on earth. God would only walk in the secret of heaven. And Job agrees, he argues, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand, where he does work, but I cannot behold him. On the right hand, but I cannot see him. The spaces remain empty. No sign whatever would plead the cause of the Most High. The so-called God would remain impassive. Calling his name would become a flatus vocis. His vastness would remain inconceivable by a human spirit. Does it mean that it would become completely insignificant? Second point of the paper, the blinking of the infinite. At the end of the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer, which is recited several times a day, people say, He, meaning God, who makes peace, shalom, in the high places, will make peace, shalom, upon us and upon all Israel, and say Amen. If we understand these words literally, we may wonder whether they are right. Astronomy has already taught us that these high places are also prone to multiple and millenary fighting between light and darkness. But perhaps we should understand the word peace otherwise. Peace would then allude to the precarious balance between the forces that govern the universe, a balance that has allowed our galaxy to stabilize and life to emerge and to grow slowly on Earth since milliards of years. Such a peace that was won over the tohu that goes on threatening it, could become a teaching for human beings. When reciting the Kaddish, some of them would probably understand that the peace that they expect to receive from God, a peace upon earth and upon Israel, would have no chance to occur unless they try to prevent the destructive forces that inhabit them from spreading without measure. What does Levinas think about such ideas? First of all, he considers that human desires remain unable to draw meaning from the initial geometrical and physical impassiveness of the infinite cosmical spaces. Actually, these desires, and this is precisely the case in the prayer I have just mentioned, try to understand these spaces in reference to a cultural layer that would make them signifying and speaking. Yet, according to Levinas, if this signification and these words do exist, they only exist in the human psyche and in the different cultures in which the human psyche expresses itself. And he says, in other words than being, never could psychological signification draw the infinite spaces out of their silence. Consequently, he wonders whether when we speak of the homogeneity of the spaces, of their synchrony, or of spatial continuity, it is indeed an original language. On the contrary, he wants to explain that what he calls proximity is not borrowed from the uninhabited space of geometry. The absolute significance of proximity presupposes humanity. The spatial contiguity, and homogeneity are not first. On the contrary, they would be incomprehensible lest we could first understand what human proximity means first. That is to say, approach, neighborhood, contact. He also adds that homogeneity would remain incomprehensible without the human signification of justice. Proximity would not be equivalent to the measure of a distance between 2 points or 2 areas of space, a distance that would go narrowing until conscience. Proximity would not measure a distance, even a meaningful one, but an approach. In this context, the face is not the sign of a hidden reality, which I could try to decipher and to interpret. Levinas makes a clear distinction between a sign and a trace. If the face was a sign, we could imagine that there is an hidden intention in the calling that I hear when approaching a face. We could try, I'll go back to this point later on, to reach the hidden author of such a calling. But as Levinas speaks of a trace and not of a sign, it remains impossible. Indeed, I don't see the face. I don't pay attention to its loneliness within the spaces. From a social point of view, the face may not be lonely. I hear the commandment to take care of its abandonment. The trace of the infinite reaches me thus. The face is not a phenomenon, as Levinas very often stresses. I hear the commandment that emanates from it because I answer its calling. If I don't answer, I don't hear, without taking any time to think about it. The significance of the trace of the infinite, comes to me in that way only. It does not come from being, but from otherwise than being. And then Levinas add, differently from the first occurrence I mentioned before, from the absent with a capital letter. Not absence, but the absent, capital letter. One has to underline that the word absence often becomes the absent in Levinas' text. One has the relationship of the face with this absolutely absent, capital letter, from which it comes, does not indicate, does not reveal the absent, and yet this absent has a meaning in the face. Third point, the refusal of all pious thoughts. If there is a commandment emerging from the loneliness of the face in the spaces, I must not draw a premature conclusion from such a situation. I must not allow me to think that God is the one who entrusts me to take care of it. A God whose existence I would discover in that way, or a God who would thus confirm the faith in his existence that I already had. It must not be the case, because for Levinas to exist or not to exist is not the ultimate question. He does know that most religious beliefs rely on an ontology. Many people would like to be sure and to know whether or not God exists. But Levinas asks, is it the right way to think about God's enigma? Certainly not. He argues that the willingness to deduce God's existence from the calling of a face is but a simple and reassuring pious thought. Piety, devotion, is first of all opposed to responsibility. It is so because if the face was arousing devotion in me, devotion for a hidden God whose sign would emerge from the face, such a devotion would always be tempted to give him the first place. and to serve him, capital letter, rather than the neighbor. It would be him that I would have to love before perhaps loving the neighbor. It would be him that I would have to adore before perhaps answering the misery of my neighbor, or answering his misery while telling him that this is in the name of God. This is such a devotion that, rightly or not, Levinas reproaches to the mystics in general. He holds Pascal against it because Pascal writes, I quote Pascal again, if there is a God, we must love him only, and not the short-lived creatures. If there is a God, we must love him only. A great number of theology induce from this superiority of the love of God over the love of the creatures, that love must rely on being eternal or being transient. Pascal and many others argue that when we love creatures that are doomed to disappear, we suffer inevitably. Such a love may never bring back the happiness we have lost since the fall, according to many theologians. There remains in our psyche an empty trace or an infinite abyss of this first happiness, Pascal. But when we try to fill such an emptiness with pathetic and empty loves for those who are inevitably going to disappear, this is indeed a vain endeavor. To love the love of an eternal God only would fill meaningfully this empty trace, according to Pascal. Now, Levinas completely disagrees with such analysis of the trace. First, because it subordinates the love of the other to my happiness. Secondly, because it measures love to being. According to him, in all pious thoughts, even those which are strong and audacious, and not only popular and mainly aiming to console people, ontology remains prevalent. In the spiritual legacy of Occidental countries, these thoughts understand God as a being, a supreme being, and they subordinate morality to ontology. According to this thought, the nakedness of a face could eventually be understood as an openness towards the perfect being of God, but not as an openness towards the infinite beyond being, as Levinas thinks it is the case. Levinas disagrees with such thoughts, pious thought, he calls them. Be them simple thought of people who feel moved in front of a face, or thought that many ambitious theologians try to build about the face. Indeed, he writes that when facing a face, we discover the secret of the semantic of the word God. But such a secret does not reveal to us anything about the existence or the non-existence of a sublime reality that would be at the origin of the universe, a sublime reality that many theologians call God. And he concludes this paragraph, of which I have commented here, with the sentence that I have chosen for as the title for my paper: against the denials inflicted by failure, the simplicity of an extreme complexity, and a singularity mature infancy is needed. That also is the sense of the death of God, point, or of his life. My emphasis, or of his life. So I come to that, the sense of God's life. it's impossible to reach any rational conclusion about the enigma of the transcendence. Yet, it does not mean that we must surrender to faith and to faith only. This impossibility goes hand in hand with the death of God, a death that Levinas analyzes as being the death of the God of ontotheology, a God whose existence had to answer human expectation, as well as a God whose existence philosophers have tried to prove rationally. Now, to exist or not to exist, that is not Levinas' question. This God is probably dead, as Nietzsche argues is, and as Levinas himself suggests, it is the case in the following quotation. I quote Levinas, "Did not Nietzsche saying, God is dead, about the death of God take on, in the extermination camps, the meaning of a quasi-empirical fact? It would mean that the God I ask for myself, hoping that he will console me and finally answer me, this God does not exist as an existence separated from my desires." Yet Levinas immediately adds something else. The death of this precise God must lead me to discover the meaning of his life. Since Levinas does not substitute the word life for the word existence in order to save God, we must try to understand what he really means. He is looking for a signification without any ontological finality, a signification that does not prove anything. Does God exist or not? A signification that does not correspond to my desires and my worries, my happiness, my consolation, my salvation. A signification that would not rely on any positive attributes, and among them, certainly not on the attribute that describe God as all-powerful. Although even nowadays, many people don't want to abandon this attribute in spite of so many cruel refutations. A signification that would not surrender to a negative theology either, and to silence. All these significations are linked to spiritualities that grow from human abilities to understand. On the other hand, Levinas does not rely either to those spiritualities that minimize and even negate God's transcendence, so as to value only his immanence to the world within all lively realities, especially within the human psyche. In that case, God would be incessant life, action, freedom, and also the center from which all worlds emerge, as Bergson writes in his book, The Creative Evolution. This philosopher thinks that God equates the source of all lives. He remains intimate to evolution. Yet, in spite of his admiration for Bergson, Levinas does not speak of God's life in that sense. He is looking for another meaning. He describes a signification that would not be a deficit of being, a signification where the for the one for the other is a for of total gratuity, breaking with interest, for characteristic of the human fraternity outside of any pre-established system. This is precisely this signification that he links to God's life, without trying to prove whether he exists or not. And if this life of God, or also the life of the absent or of the infinite, according to the different words chosen by Levinas, the life of the absent is formed in me, in my most intimate life. It's not because it is a stimulus to my desire to persevere in my being, but because this life dedicates me to a responsibility for my neighbor, a responsibility that I cannot reject. I do not discover this life of God in me, practicing any introspection, God intimate to me, but I discover it in human fraternity, in proximity. The life of God is never experimented as a help or a mercy that I receive, but as a responsibility dragged out of my desire to persevere in my own being. This is the meaning of the word human proximity. The transcendence pulls upward into the human, writes Levinas, assuming such a paradox. To all those who wonder, where is God's glory in the world? The prophet Isaiah answers that the whole earth is indeed full of his glory, kavod. Even when we remain unable to perceive it, Levinas would not agree. He would argue that we must not look for such a glory while admiring the spaces or the wonders of nature or expecting a so-called providence. But he used the word glory. According to him, the one and only possibility that we have to get near God's glory is when we answer, "Here I am," to our neighbor. Yet, when it occurs, we ignore that we are near God's glory. Our psyche testifies to this glory without any certainty about the existence of God, without faith in him, and without having decided consciously and freely to do so. To expose oneself to the life of the neighbor without any reserve, even admitting substitution and becoming the hostage of his or her suffering. To do all that we can, so that the other could live, says Levinas, would be a testimony of the glory, kavod, of the infinite, that is to say, of its weg, kavod in Hebrew, on our fleeting human life. Conclusion. The four letters of the unpronounceable name of God watch over the impossibility to get any idea of God. The tres signifies this unpronounceable name. It signifies the name of the absent who has always passed. This name is not enclosed within any sed. It is not found within the different possible themes of thought, and it goes over the borders of logic. This is indeed an extravagant name. It escaped from all the rules of rational and reasonable talk. The name of this absent remains inappropriable and unknowable, yet its trace remains alive on the neighbor's face. This absent, capital A, has left a seal on the creatures, but it is not a proof of his existence. It does not protect anybody from the violence of the world and from hatred. Furthermore, one ignores how to authenticate truly such a seal. It only announces that a signification previous to all our talks, be them philosophical or theological or commonplace conversations, resist to them. This is the resistance of the first saying, the resistance of an anarchic and immemorial forward of all languages and nouns. One may hear this first saying resonated in the human answer to the calling of the faith, "Here I am," in any. God may have no existence, but he remains alive as long as this answer is heard somewhere in the world, for the little humanity that adorns the earth. Thank you.